The letter arrived on the worst possible day, which seemed fitting given how Daniel Trent's life had been unfolding lately. It was a Tuesday in late November, the kind of grey, bitter morning where even the sun seemed to have given up trying. He'd just received the eviction notice, bright orange, impossible to ignore, taped to his apartment door like a scarlet letter for the modern age. 30 days, that's all he had. 30 days to find somewhere for him and Sophie to live. 30 days to conjure money he didn't have. 30 days to perform a miracle. He was sitting on the threadbare couch, the one with the springs that poked through if you sat too far to the left, when he noticed the envelope among the usual stack of bills and collection notices. This one was different, heavier paper, an actual wax seal, burgundy and official-looking, pressed with initials he didn't recognize. The return address was from a law firm in Oregon, Blackwood, Sterling and Associates, attorneys at law, established 1892. The kind of firm that sounded like it had been handling estates since before electricity. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, not from hope, but from the exhausted anxiety that had become his constant companion since his wife's death, since losing his job at the manufacturing plant, since everything had fallen apart like a house of cards in a windstorm. The letter was typed on cream-colored paper so thick it felt like fabric. "Dear Mr. Trent," it began, formal and distant. "We regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Leopold Matthias Grimshaw, who departed this life on October 3rd of this year. As the sole surviving heir to Mr. Grimshaw's estate, we are contacting you regarding the inheritance of his property located at 7800 Cedarwood Lane, Thornhill County, Oregon." Daniel read the words 3 times before they began to make sense. Leopold Matthias Grimshaw. The name triggered a faint, dusty memory, his grandfather mentioning a great-uncle or maybe a cousin twice removed, someone from the old country who'd come over during the war. Which war he'd never been clear on. His grandfather had died when Daniel was 15, and most of those family stories had died with him. The letter continued in its formal, bloodless language. There was property, a house and approximately 140 acres of forested land. No mortgage, no liens, no outstanding debts. It was his if he wanted it. All he had to do was come to Oregon, sign the papers, and take possession. "Dad." Sophie appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas even though it was nearly 10 o'clock in the morning. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with his grey eyes and her mother's determined chin. "Are we still having cereal for breakfast?" They'd been having cereal for every meal for the past 4 days, ever since his last paycheck from the warehouse had run out. The same generic cornflakes getting soggier in cheaper and cheaper milk. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, folding the letter carefully. "Just cereal today." He didn't tell her about the letter. Not yet. Hope was a dangerous thing to give a child when you'd been disappointing her for months. That afternoon, after Sophie left for school, he'd managed to scrape together enough for her lunch money at least. Daniel called the law firm. The receptionist transferred him to a Mr. Blackwood, who sounded approximately 1,000 years old, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "Ah, yes, Mr. Trent," he said when Daniel explained who he was. "I'm glad you called. We weren't certain we'd be able to locate you. Your great-uncle was quite specific in his will. The property goes to you and only you." "I don't understand," Daniel said. "I never even met him. Why would he leave me anything?" There was a pause long enough that he thought the call might have dropped. Then Blackwood cleared his throat. Mr. Grimshaw was an intensely private individual. He had no children, no other living relatives that we could locate. Your grandfather was apparently his closest living relative before he passed, and you are his only descendant. The inheritance is quite clear, though I must warn you." Another pause. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. There was always a catch. The property has been unoccupied for some time. Mr. Grimshaw lived there alone for many decades, and the house is quite remote. There's no nearby town to speak of. Thornhill is more of a hamlet than anything else. The nearest grocery store is about 40 minutes away. It's not what one would call convenient. Remote. Isolated. In the middle of nowhere. To Daniel, it sounded like paradise. No landlords, no eviction notices, no neighbors complaining when Sophie ran in the hallways. A roof over their heads that nobody could take away. "When can I see it?" he asked. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Sophie were driving through Oregon in his ancient Honda, the one that sounded like it was coughing up a lung every time he went over 40 miles per hour. The lawyer had arranged everything: keys, property deed, even a small advance on what he called estate funds to help with moving expenses. It wasn't much, barely enough for gas and a few nights in a cheap motel, but it was more money than Daniel had seen in one place in months. They drove north through Oregon as November bled into December, the landscape growing increasingly barren. The highways gave way to state routes, then county roads, then barely paved tracks that wound through forests so dense they seemed to swallow the weak winter sunlight. Sophie pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Are we almost there?" she asked for probably the 50th time. "Close," Daniel lied. According to the GPS, which kept losing signal, they still had another hour, maybe more. The trees here were different from anywhere Daniel had ever been. Massive Douglas firs, so tall they seemed to scrape the grey belly of the sky, their branches heavy with old snow. White alders stood like bone-white sentinels. And there was something else, something darker and more ancient. Trees he couldn't name that seemed to lean in toward the road as they passed. They saw fewer and fewer signs of civilization. An abandoned gas station, its windows dark and broken. A church with a collapsed roof, its parking lot overtaken by weeds. A rusted sign pointing toward Thornhill, Pop 87, though the town itself was nowhere to be seen. "Dad," Sophie said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Daniel glance over. "Why are all the houses empty?" She was right. Every few miles they'd pass a farmhouse or cabin, and every single one appeared abandoned. Doors hanging open, windows like hollow eyes, gardens gone to wilderness. It was as if everyone had simply walked away one day and never come back. "Maybe people moved to bigger towns," Daniel said, trying to sound casual, "for work and stuff." But it felt wrong. There was something about this place, about the quality of the silence that pressed against his eardrums like the air pressure before a storm. The GPS finally gave up entirely about 20 minutes from their destination. Daniel had to rely on the printed directions the lawyer had provided, following a series of increasingly obscure landmarks: turn left at the triple trunk spruce, continue for 0.7 mi past the old Brennan property, stone foundation only, look for the break in the tree line. When they finally found Cedarwood Lane, it wasn't really a road at all, more like a suggestion of one, two dirt ruts separated by a spine of frozen grass. The Honda bounced and groaned as Daniel navigated the potholes. On either side, the forest pressed close, branches scraping against the car windows like fingers trying to get in. "There," Sophie pointed. Through the trees, Daniel caught his first glimpse of the house. It sat in a clearing that seemed almost surgically precise, a perfect circle of land cut from the surrounding forest. The house itself was larger than he'd expected, 2 stories, maybe 2,000 square feet, built from dark stone and weathered timber. It was old, clearly, but not in the way he'd anticipated. He'd been expecting derelict, abandoned, falling apart. Instead, the house looked almost pristine. The roof was intact, the windows unbroken. Even the paint on the front door looked fresh, a deep burgundy that matched the wax seal on the lawyer's letter. But there was something off about it. Something that made Daniel's scalp prickle as he turned off the engine. The house was too neat, too preserved, like a museum exhibit rather than a place where someone had actually lived. And surrounding the property at irregular intervals were signs, yellow metal signs, weathered but still readable, mounted on metal poles driven deep into the frozen ground. Restricted area. Authorized personnel only. No trespassing. Military property warning. Government testing site. What do those mean? Sophie asked, her voice small. Probably old signs, Daniel said with more confidence than he felt, from a long time ago. Maybe they used this land for training during one of the wars. He was grasping at explanations, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The lawyer hadn't mentioned anything about military property or government testing. But then again, he hadn't mentioned much of anything beyond the basics. They got out of the car and the cold hit Daniel like a slap. It was a different kind of cold than what they'd left behind. Deeper, more penetrating, the kind that seemed to seep straight into your bones. The clearing was absolutely silent. No birds, no rustling animals, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. Just that heavy, pressing silence that made Daniel want to whisper, even though there was no one around to disturb. The front door was solid wood, old but beautifully maintained, with an iron lock that looked like it probably belonged in a castle. Daniel fumbled with the key ring the lawyer had given him. 3 keys, each one different, each one labeled in faded ink. The first one, marked front, slid into the lock with surprising ease. The door swung open, and Daniel stepped inside. The first thing that hit him was the smell. Not the musty, abandoned smell he'd expected, but something else entirely, clean, almost antiseptic, with an underlying hint of something metallic. The air inside the house was warmer than outside, noticeably so, as if the heating system was still running. "Hello?" Daniel called out, his voice echoing through the empty hallway. Nothing. Of course, nothing. The house had been empty since October. Mr. Blackwood had been very clear about that. The interior of the house was just as strange as the exterior. The entryway opened into a large main room, and everywhere Daniel looked, he saw signs of meticulous preservation. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but underneath he could see shapes, a couch, chairs, tables, all seemingly untouched by time. The wooden floor was dusty, but not rotted. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and though they were clearly old, there were no cracks, no water damage, no signs of the decay that should have set in decades ago. Sophie ventured further into the house, her footsteps loud in the silence. "Dad, there's a kitchen. And it's huge." Daniel followed her, his unease growing with each step. The kitchen was indeed massive, dominated by an enormous cast-iron stove that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. But it was the cabinets that made him stop short. They were full. Not just full, but stocked, like someone was planning to ride out the apocalypse. Can after can, jar after jar, all lined up with military precision. Daniel pulled one down, his hands trembling slightly. The label was faded but still legible, U.S. Army Field Rations. Beans and bacon. 1946. Nearly 80 years ago. He opened another cabinet. More cans, more jars, all from the same era. 1944, 1945, 1947. Some had labels he recognized, Campbell's, Heinz, but others were military issue, stamped with government codes and dire warnings about proper storage. "Sophie, don't touch anything yet," he called out, moving through the house. The living room contained a massive stone fireplace, and next to it, a stack of newspapers. Daniel picked up the top one carefully. The Thornhill Chronicle, November 12, 1948. The headline screamed about housing shortages and the Berlin blockade. The paper was yellowed but intact, as if it had been delivered yesterday rather than 77 years ago. Upstairs they found 4 bedrooms, all furnished, all covered in that same protective sheeting. One room was clearly a child's bedroom, with a small bed and toys that looked like they belonged in a museum, tin soldiers, a wooden train set, alphabet blocks that predated television. Sophie reached for them, but Daniel stopped her. "Not yet, sweetheart. Let's figure out what's safe first." The bathroom was equally strange. The fixtures were antique, a clawfoot tub, a pedestal sink, a toilet with a pull chain. But when Daniel experimentally turned the tap, water came out, rusty at first, then running clear and surprisingly warm. How was there running water? How was anything working? It was in the hallway that Daniel noticed the lights. Small glass fixtures mounted on the walls, the kind that used to burn oil or gas. But these weren't oil lamps. Inside each one was what looked like a filament bulb, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible hum coming from somewhere in the walls. Electricity. He found the switch near the stairs and flipped it. The lights flickered, buzzed, then came on, casting a warm yellow glow through the hallway. The bulbs looked ancient, but they worked. How is this possible? Daniel whispered to himself. The hidden room door was at the back of the kitchen, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. It was different from the other doors in the house, newer, made of heavy steel rather than wood, with 3 separate locks and a handle that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. Above the door, stenciled in faded red paint, were words that made Daniel's blood run cold: authorized personnel only. Restricted access. Security clearance required. He tried the second key, marked interior, but it didn't fit any of the locks. Neither did the third key. The door remained stubbornly, mysteriously locked. "What's in there?" Sophie asked, appearing at his elbow. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But we'll figure it out." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, trying to make sense of their inheritance. The house was a puzzle, each room revealing more questions than answers. In the study, they found filing cabinets full of documents, all of them stamped confidential or classified in bold red letters. Daniel tried to read them, but they were full of technical jargon he didn't understand, references to Project Frozen Harbor, Phase 3 testing, containment protocols. In the master bedroom, they found clothes from the 1940s, all of them in perfect condition, hanging in the closet as if waiting for their owner to return. Men's clothes, military issue mostly, but also civilian wear, suits, ties, dress shirts. In the bureau, carefully folded, were items that made Daniel's skin crawl: military dog tags, Leopold M. Grimshaw, serial number, blood type AB negative, a Purple Heart medal, photographs of men in uniform standing in front of this very house. But it was the photograph on the nightstand that made Daniel pick it up with trembling hands. It showed a man, late 30s maybe, standing in the clearing outside. He was tall, thin, with the kind of face that suggested he hadn't smiled in years. Behind him, clearly visible, were the warning signs. But this wasn't what made Daniel's heart race. It was the date stamped on the back of the photograph, March 8, 1949. If this was Leopold Grimshaw, and who else could it be, then he'd been young in this photo, very young. Which meant he'd have to be what? In his 90s? Over 100? The lawyer had said he was an old man when he died, but he'd made it sound like Leopold had died at a ripe, but not unusual, age. As the afternoon bled into evening, Daniel found a generator shed behind the house, well-maintained and humming with power. That explained the electricity, though not how the generator was still running after months of supposedly being untended. Next to the generator was a propane tank, also full, connected to a heating system that seemed to be keeping the house at a steady temperature. It was as if someone had prepared the house to run indefinitely without human intervention. As if Leopold Grimshaw had known he would die and had set everything up to preserve his home exactly as it was. But why? Sophie was getting tired and hungry, so Daniel raided the ancient pantry, half expecting the cans to explode or poison them. He opened a can of stew dated 1947, and to his amazement, it looked fine, smelled fine. When he heated it on the old stove, which worked, because of course it did, it even tasted fine. Better than fine, actually, like it had been canned yesterday. They ate in the kitchen as darkness fell outside. The windows, Daniel noticed, were all original glass, wavy and imperfect. But they were covered on the inside with something else, a layer of what looked like plastic or acrylic, almost invisible until you looked closely. Soundproofing? Protection? He didn't know. "Dad," Sophie said, pushing stew around her bowl. "Do we have to stay here?" Daniel looked at his daughter, saw the fear and uncertainty in her eyes, and felt his heart break a little. He wanted to tell her they'd find somewhere else, somewhere normal, somewhere that didn't feel like they were living in a time capsule or a bomb shelter or whatever this place was. But he couldn't lie to her. "Not about this." "We don't have anywhere else to go, sweetheart," he said gently. "But we'll make it work. We'll make it home." Sophie nodded, but she didn't look convinced. They made beds upstairs in one of the guest rooms, using sheets they found in a linen closet that smelled of lavender and something else, something chemical and preservative. Daniel tucked Sophie in, lay down beside her, and stared at the ceiling as exhaustion pulled at his bones. The house settled around them with creaks and groans, the normal sounds of an old building cooling down for the night. Daniel found them oddly comforting. At least these were sounds he understood. He must have dozed off, because he woke with a start to complete darkness and absolute silence. The kind of silence that was almost physical, pressing against his eardrums. He fumbled for his phone. 2:37 in the morning. Sophie was asleep beside him, breathing softly. Daniel was about to close his eyes again when he heard it, a sound from below them, from beneath the house. It wasn't a normal house sound. It was rhythmic, mechanical, a low hum rising and falling. And beneath that, something else, something that might have been voices, or might have been machinery, or might have been something he didn't have words for. Daniel sat up slowly, his heart beginning to hammer. The sound continued, pulsing up through the floorboards. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. From the hidden room, maybe? Or from even deeper. How deep did this house go? He got out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Sophie, and moved to the bedroom door. In the hallway, the sound was louder, definitely coming from below. He crept down the stairs, each step producing a creak that seemed deafening in the silence. In the kitchen, Daniel stood in front of the steel door to the hidden room. The sound was definitely coming from the other side. That low mechanical hum, and beneath it, something that rose and fell like breathing, like the house itself had lungs and was inhaling, exhaling, waiting. He tried the handle. Locked, of course. But as he stood there, his hand on the cold metal, he felt something else, a vibration. The door was vibrating slightly, as if machinery was running on the other side, as if something down there was awake and active and had been this whole time. Daniel stepped back, his mind racing. What had Leopold Grimshaw been doing in this house? What was Project Frozen Harbor? Why were there military warning signs around a private residence? And why, after decades of abandonment, was something still running in the hidden room? The sound continued, rising and falling, a heartbeat in the darkness. Daniel stood in the kitchen of his inheritance, the house he'd thought was a blessing, and felt the first cold fingers of real fear creeping up his spine. Outside, beyond the windows with their invisible protective layer, the forest pressed close. And deep below, something hummed and breathed and waited in the dark. The Douglas firs whispered to each other in a wind Daniel couldn't hear, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the frozen air, came a sound that might have been an animal howling, or might have been something else entirely. Daniel moved to the window, peered out into the darkness. For just a moment, he thought he saw lights, small bobbing points of illumination moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. There and gone so quickly he couldn't be sure he'd seen them at all. He stood there for a long time, watching, listening to the sounds from beneath the house, wondering what exactly he and Sophie had inherited, wondering what Leopold Grimshaw had left behind, wondering what secrets were locked behind that steel door, and whether he really wanted to know the answers. The night offered no response, just that steady mechanical hum, that pulse, that breathing. And in the morning, Daniel knew he would have to decide, stay and uncover the mystery, or run while they still could. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, Daniel already knew they weren't leaving. They couldn't. This was all they had. This house with its impossible preservation, its military secrets, its locked hidden room door, its sounds in the night. This was home now, for better or worse, and tomorrow he would start finding answers. Daniel didn't sleep again that night. He sat in the kitchen, watching the steel door to the hidden room, listening to that rhythmic hum that seemed to pulse through the entire house. When dawn finally crept through the windows, grey and reluctant, he felt like he'd aged a decade in the span of a few hours. Sophie shuffled into the kitchen around 7, her hair sticking up at odd angles, still wearing the clothes she'd slept in. "What's for breakfast?" she asked, then stopped when she saw her father's face. "Dad, are you okay?" Daniel forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just didn't sleep well. New house, you know." He stood, his joints protesting. "Let's see what else is in those magic cabinets." They found powdered eggs dated 1946 that reconstituted into something surprisingly edible, and coffee, actual coffee, not instant, that was so strong it made Daniel's teeth ache. As they ate, he watched Sophie, wondering how much to tell her. She was 7. 7-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about mysterious sounds in hidden rooms and government warning signs and houses that shouldn't exist. But then again, 7-year-olds also shouldn't have to worry about evictions and empty refrigerators and mothers who died too young and left them alone with fathers who barely knew how to function. "Sophie," he said carefully, "I need to explore the property today. Really look around. Would you be okay staying inside? Maybe in the living room where I can see you from the windows." She nodded, fork paused halfway to her mouth. "What are you looking for?" "Answers," Daniel said honestly. "This place doesn't make sense. I need to figure out why." After breakfast, Daniel bundled into his inadequate winter coat and stepped outside. The cold was somehow worse in daylight, revealing itself in all its brutal clarity. The clearing around the house was maybe an acre, the grass frozen into stiff brown spikes. Beyond it, the forest pressed in like a wall, those massive firs creating a barrier that seemed almost deliberate. He walked the perimeter first, examining the warning signs more closely. They were weathered, but not ancient. The metal was modern, probably replaced at some point in the last few decades. But the posts they were mounted on were old, sunk deep into the ground, concrete foundations visible beneath years of accumulated soil and moss. Restricted area. Authorized personnel only. The word seemed to watch him as he moved. Who had put them here? When? And more importantly, were they still valid? Behind the house, past the generator shed, Daniel found something he'd missed in the gathering dusk the night before, a path. Not obvious, barely more than a deer trail, but definitely a path, worn into the frozen ground by decades of foot traffic. He followed it for about 50 yards until it opened into a smaller clearing. In the center sat a structure he almost missed, so overgrown with vines and moss that it blended into the forest, a concrete bunker, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with a steel door that matched the one to the hidden room. Next to it, barely visible beneath decades of leaf litter, was something else. Daniel knelt, brushing away the debris, and revealed a metal plate set flush with the ground. It was maybe 3 feet across, heavy-gauge steel with a recessed handle and what looked like a combination lock. His heart began to hammer. What was this? A well? A storage vault? Another entrance? He was so focused on the metal plate that he almost missed the chest. It was tucked against the side of the concrete structure, protected from the elements by the overhang of the roof, wood, badly weathered, with metal reinforcement bands that had rusted to a deep orange-brown. The lock had long since corroded away. Daniel glanced back toward the house. He could just see one of the upstairs windows from here. Then he carefully pried open the chest. The hinges screamed in protest, and for a moment he was certain the whole thing would disintegrate, but the wood held and the lid swung open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crumbled at his touch, were papers, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. He pulled out the first bundle carefully. Journals, handwritten, the ink faded but still legible in a cramped, precise script that spoke of engineering training and methodical habits. The first page bore a date, January 15, 1943, and a name, Robert Matthias Grimshaw. Daniel's breath caught. Grimshaw. His family name. This must be Leopold's father, or perhaps an uncle. His great-grandfather, maybe, or great-great-grandfather. The family tree was fuzzy in his mind, all those connections his grandfather had tried to teach him and he'd never paid enough attention to. He sat on the frozen ground, his back against the concrete bunker, and began to read. January 15, 1943. Arrived at the site today. 27 hours by train from Washington, then another 6 by truck on roads that barely deserve the name. They wouldn't tell us the exact location until we were already here. Somewhere in the mountains of Oregon. That's all I know. Security is unlike anything I've ever seen. Papers checked 6 times. Guards with machine guns at every checkpoint. They made us sign documents that promised execution for disclosure. I still don't know exactly what we're building. They call it Project Arctic Vault, but that's just a code name. Colonel Ashford says we're constructing the future, that what we do here will ensure America survives no matter what happens in Europe or the Pacific. Heavy stuff for a construction engineer who's used to building bridges and factories. The site is perfect for what they need, isolated, defensible, on solid bedrock. There's an old homestead here, abandoned since the Depression. We'll incorporate it into the plan, use it as the surface entrance. Below ground, though, that's where the real work begins. Daniel flipped through the pages, his fingers numb with cold, his mind racing. More entries spanning months, then years. Robert Grimshaw had spent 3 years at this site, overseeing construction of something vast and complex. The journals were full of technical specifications, diagrams of tunnels and chambers, calculations for load-bearing walls and ventilation systems. But it was the entry from September 12, 1944 that made Daniel's blood run cold. The first shipment arrived today. Trucks at 0300 hours, flanked by armored vehicles. I wasn't allowed to see what they were unloading, but I heard the guards talking when they thought no one was listening. Platinum. Bars of it. Hundreds of tons, maybe more. They're storing it in Chamber 7, the deepest section, the one with the special environmental controls. Colonel Ashford finally told me the truth tonight, over whiskey in his temporary office. Arctic Vault isn't just a storage facility. It's a hedge against Armageddon. If the war goes south, if Europe falls completely, if the Nazis get the bomb first, America needs to be able to rebuild. They're caching everything here. Platinum, documents, seeds, technology, everything needed to restart civilization if the worst happens. He made me swear on my life to keep it secret, said, there are only 12 people in the whole country who know the full scope of Arctic Vault. The president knows, a handful of generals and admirals, and us, the poor bastards who built it. I asked him what happens after the war. He just smiled, that cold smile of his, and said, after the war, Robert, this place will be forgotten officially. It will never have existed, and that's how it needs to stay. Daniel's hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn the pages. Platinum. Tons of platinum hidden beneath the house he'd inherited, beneath his feet right now. The journals continued, more shipments, more construction. Robert Grimshaw described creating a facility that was designed to remain viable for 50 years, maybe 100, with minimal maintenance. State-of-the-art climate control systems, well, state-of-the-art for 1944, generators that ran on propane and could operate for decades, sealed chambers that would preserve their contents indefinitely. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The last one was dated November 7, 1945. The war is over. Germany surrendered in May, Japan in August. We won. But Arctic Vault continues. The shipments keep coming. The chambers keep filling. I asked Ashford why, if the emergency is over, why continue? He told me things I wish I didn't know. That the war might be over, but the danger isn't. That we're already facing a new enemy, one with nuclear weapons and ambitions to match our own. That Arctic Vault needs to be ready for the next crisis. And the one after that. They're shutting down the construction. Most of the crew is being transferred, sworn to secrecy, scattered to the winds. But someone needs to stay. Someone needs to maintain the facility, watch over it, make sure it stays ready. Leopold volunteered. My son. My brilliant, patriotic, foolish son. He's 26 years old, and he's volunteering to spend the rest of his life as a watchman for a bunker that officially doesn't exist. They're going to set him up in the house, give him a stipend, keep him supplied. All he has to do is make sure the systems keep running and that no one ever discovers what's down there. I tried to talk him out of it, but you can't argue with Leopold when he's made up his mind. He says it's his duty. He says someone has to do it. God help me, I think I've sentenced my son to a lifetime of loneliness and secrets. The journal entries ended there, but Daniel found other papers in the chest, letters from Leopold to his father, spanning decades. They were brief, clinical, updates on maintenance schedules and system checks. The emotional distance in them was heartbreaking. A man slowly disappearing into his duty, becoming less human and more machine with each passing year. The last letter was dated January 3, 2024, almost 2 years ago. Father, though you're long gone, I continue these reports out of habit. The systems are stable. The facility remains secure. I am 86 years old. My health is failing. I have lived my entire adult life in service of a mission that the world has forgotten. The government stopped checking in on me 20 years ago. The stipend stopped coming 30 years ago. I suspect they simply lost the paperwork, or everyone who knew about Arctic Vault died and took the secret with them. I've ensured that the facility will continue running for at least another 50 years. The solar panels I installed in 1987 still provide adequate power. The propane tanks are full. The environmental systems are self-sustaining. I've arranged for the property to pass to the only family member I could locate, Daniel Trent, your great-grandson. He doesn't know me. He doesn't know any of this. Perhaps that's for the best. Let someone untouched by our family's burden decide what to do with our legacy. I am tired, Father. So very tired. Soon I will rest, and Arctic Vault will pass into history, or legend, or nothing at all. Your son, Leopold. Daniel sat among the frozen leaves and ancient papers, tears running down his cheeks without him really noticing. Leopold Grimshaw had spent 60 years of his life guarding a secret that his own government had apparently forgotten. 60 years alone in this house, maintaining systems, watching over platinum and artifacts and whatever else was stored in the chambers beneath his feet. 60 years of loyalty to a mission that no longer mattered to anyone but him. And now it was his, the house, the secret, the burden. Dad! Sophie's voice, faint but urgent, carried from the house. Daniel jerked to awareness, realized he'd been sitting here for over an hour, lost in the past. He gathered up the journals, there were too many to carry all at once, he'd have to make multiple trips, and hurried back toward the house. Sophie was standing at the living room window, waving frantically. He could see her face pressed against the glass, urgent and excited. What had she found? Daniel burst through the front door, journals clutched to his chest. What is it? Are you okay? Dad, come look. Sophie was at the fireplace, the massive stone structure that dominated the living room. I was just looking at the stones because they're really cool, and I pushed one, and look. She pressed her hand against what looked like a completely ordinary stone, about 3 feet up from the hearth. There was a click, barely audible, and then movement. The entire back panel of the fireplace, the part that should have been solid brick and mortar, swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it, revealed in the dim light, was a switch panel, industrial-looking, grey metal with 3 heavy-duty switches labeled in that same stenciled military lettering Daniel had seen on the hidden room door. Power. Lights. Lock release. Daniel's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might crack a rib. Sophie, step back. But what is it? I don't know yet. Just step back, okay? The switches were all in the down position, off. How had Sophie even found the trigger stone? Pure luck, or was something guiding her? Some instinct he didn't want to examine too closely? Daniel thought of the journals, of Leopold's letters, of 60 years of lonely duty. He thought of the hidden room door with its 3 locks and the sounds he'd heard last night and the possibility of systems still running after 80 years. And he thought of platinum. Hundreds of tons of platinum hidden in chambers beneath this house. Platinum that could change his life, that could give Sophie everything she deserved, that could be the answer to every problem they'd ever faced. His hand trembling, Daniel flipped the first switch. Power. Nothing happened, or nothing he could perceive. But somewhere in the walls, something hummed to life. The sound was familiar. It was the same hum he'd heard last night, only now it was louder, more immediate. The second switch. Lights. Throughout the house, lights flickered on. Not the old-fashioned bulbs in the hallway fixtures, but something else, recessed lighting he hadn't noticed before, embedded in the ceiling molding, casting a cool white glow that was distinctly modern. Emergency lighting, like you'd find in a hospital or bunker. The third switch. Lock release. From the kitchen came a sound like a gunshot, 3 heavy metallic thunks in quick succession. The locks on the hidden room door. Daniel realized they'd just opened. "Stay here," he told Sophie, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay in this room. Do not follow me. Do you understand?" She nodded, eyes wide, and Daniel could see his own fear reflected back at him. But he'd come too far to stop now. He needed to know. He needed to see. The hidden room door stood open, just a crack, no longer sealed. Beyond it, concrete steps descended into darkness. But as Daniel approached, lights flickered on, motion activated, he realized, revealing a staircase that went down much farther than any normal basement should go. 20 steps. 30, more. The air that wafted up was cold and dry, carrying that same antiseptic smell he'd noticed when first entering the house, but stronger now. Sterile. Preserved. Daniel descended. The stairs opened into a corridor. Not a basement, not a cellar, but a proper corridor. Concrete walls painted institutional grey, with more of those emergency lights embedded in the ceiling every 10 feet. The corridor stretched ahead for what looked like 50 yards, ending in a heavy steel door, but there were other doors along the way, each one labeled with stenciled numbers and letters. Chamber 1. Chamber 2. Storage 3A. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The temperature was constant, maybe 55 degrees, maintained by climate control systems he could hear humming in the walls. After 80 years. Still running after 80 years. The first door was unlocked. Daniel pulled it open and was greeted by a room maybe 20 feet square, lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and metal shelves. Documents. Thousands of them, all in protective sleeves. He pulled one at random, technical specifications for something called a proximity fuse. Another document detailed manufacturing processes for synthetic rubber. Blueprints for aircraft engines. All stamped classified. All dated between 1942 and 1946. This was what Robert Grimshaw had described in his journals. Not just platinum, but knowledge. Everything America would need to rebuild if civilization collapsed. The second chamber was full of seeds, not loose, but in sealed containers, vacuum-packed, preserved in metal bins that were covered in frost. He could see labels through the ice: wheat, hybrid strain 7. Corn, drought-resistant. Potatoes, cold climate. And somewhere, someone was watching. Someone knew. Outside, beyond the windows, the forest seemed darker than before. The shadows between the trees deeper, the silence more oppressive. Daniel thought of the lights he'd seen last night, bobbing between the pines. Not his imagination. Not animals. Watchers. Guardians. People who knew about Arctic Vault and had been keeping tabs on it all these years, just like Leopold had. But unlike Leopold, Daniel had a daughter to protect. A life to live. Dreams that didn't include spending the next 60 years guarding a government secret that might not even be a secret anymore. He had to think. Had to plan. Had to figure out what to do before whoever was monitoring this place decided he was a threat that needed to be eliminated. The motion sensor light had been a warning. Next time, it might be something worse. Daniel held Sophie tighter and stared at the sealed hidden room door, behind which lay enough wealth to solve every problem he'd ever had, or to get them both killed. The house settled around them. The generators hummed. The refrigeration systems in Chamber 7, 80 feet below, continued their decades-long work. And somewhere in the forest, Daniel was certain, someone was watching the house. Watching him. Waiting to see what he would do next. The inheritance nobody wanted had just become a lot more complicated. He kept Sophie inside, made excuses about wanting to settle in properly while his eyes constantly tracked to the windows, watching for movement in the forest, for any sign that the motion sensor had alerted someone to their presence. He didn't go back down to the hidden room. Couldn't bring himself to flip those switches again, to descend into that preserved tomb with its impossible wealth and its watching eyes. Instead, he tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, cooking meals from the ancient but inexplicably preserved food stores, helping Sophie with the schoolwork he'd brought, reading her stories at night while listening for sounds that didn't belong. The house was full of sounds. It settled and creaked, groaned and whispered. Every noise made him jump. Every shadow made his heart race. He found himself sleeping in shifts, dozing for an hour or two before jerking awake, certain he'd heard footsteps on the stairs or breathing outside the bedroom door. On the third morning, while Sophie was still asleep, Daniel stood at the kitchen window with his terrible coffee and watched the sun try to break through the grey clouds. That's when he saw it. A vehicle, moving slowly along the dirt track that passed for a road, maybe a quarter-mile from the house. He could just make out its shape through the trees, dark, boxy, some kind of SUV or truck. It moved past the property without stopping, but slowly, deliberately, like someone surveying rather than traveling. Daniel's hands tightened on his mug. Could be nothing. Could be a hunter, a local, someone who had every right to be on these forest roads. Except something in his gut said otherwise. The way the vehicle had crawled past, the way it seemed to pause at certain points, as if the driver was taking notes or photographs. He was still standing there, watching, when Sophie came downstairs. "Dad, is everything okay?" Daniel forced himself to smile, to turn away from the window. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just admiring the view." But everything wasn't fine. And it got worse. The second vehicle appeared that afternoon. Different from the first, this one was a sedan, completely inappropriate for these rough forest roads. It appeared from the opposite direction, moving just as slowly, just as deliberately. Daniel watched it from the upstairs window, his stomach churning. 2 vehicles in one day, on a road that supposedly led nowhere, in an area the lawyer had said was all but abandoned. That evening, after he put Sophie to bed with promises that everything was fine, Daniel found the letter. It was on the porch, tucked under the doormat. Not mailed, hand-delivered. A plain white envelope, sealed, with no address, no stamp, no return information. Just his name written in neat block letters on the front. Daniel Trent. His hand shook as he opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, with 5 words typed in the center. "You're not alone in that house." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. He spun around, scanning the clearing, the tree line, looking for whoever had left this. But there was nothing, just the forest and the shadows and the gathering darkness. He crumpled the letter in his fist and went back inside, locking the door, checking the windows, his mind racing. Who had left this? What did it mean? Was it a threat? A warning? And what did they know? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep at all. He sat in the living room with every light in the house blazing, a kitchen knife on the table beside him, listening to the house breathe and settle and creak. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, exhausted beyond measure, he finally dozed off in the armchair. He woke to pale morning light and Sophie's voice. "Dad, why are you sleeping in the chair?" "Just fell asleep reading," he lied, shoving the knife under a cushion before she could see it. "Come on, let's get breakfast." But Daniel had made a decision during his sleepless vigil. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help, or at least information. The nearest town, if you could call 87 people a town, was Thornhill, about 40 minutes down increasingly sketchy roads. According to the GPS, it had a post office, a general store, and a sheriff's station. He bundled Sophie into the car around 10 o'clock, telling her they were going on an adventure to explore the local area. The drive through the forest was nerve-wracking. Every bend in the road might hide a vehicle waiting for them. Every shadow between the trees might conceal a person watching. But they saw nothing. No one. Just miles of winter-dead forest and abandoned buildings. Thornhill was even more depressing in daylight than he'd imagined from the empty houses they'd passed. The town consisted of maybe 30 buildings scattered along a single street, most of them vacant, their windows dark and their yards overgrown. The general store was open, He could see a tired-looking woman through the window, and the sheriff's station had a patrol car parked outside, which was promising. Daniel left Sophie in the car with strict instructions to lock the doors and not talk to anyone, then approached the station. It was a small brick building that looked like it had been there since the 1930s, with a faded state seal on the door and bars on the windows. Inside, a man sat behind a desk that was more paper than wood. He was maybe 60, with grey hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades working outdoors. His nameplate read, Sheriff Thomas Reeves. He looked up when Daniel entered, and something flickered across his face. Surprise? Recognition? Daniel couldn't quite read it. Help you? He asked, his voice carrying the flat vowels of rural Oregon. I'm Daniel Trent, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. I just inherited property out on Cedarwood Lane. The old Grimshaw place. The sheriff's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something subtle, sharpened, became more alert. Leopold Grimshaw's place, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. My great-great-uncle, apparently. I'm having some concerns about the property. What kind of concerns? Daniel chose his words carefully. Strange vehicles driving past. A letter left on my porch with no return address. I have a young daughter with me, and I'm feeling unsafe. Sheriff Reeves leaned back in his chair, which creaked alarmingly. He studied Daniel for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and closed the door to his office, which Daniel noted with growing unease. Mr. Trent, he said, returning to his desk, how much do you know about that property? Just that I inherited it. The lawyer said it had been in the family, that Leopold lived there alone for decades. And did the lawyer mention anything about the property's history? About what was there during the war? Daniel's mouth went dry. He said it was remote. That's all. The sheriff nodded slowly. That land was restricted during wartime. 1942 through 1946, officially. Unofficially, longer. Military installation. Government project. The specifics were classified and remain classified. Most of the records don't exist anymore, burned, lost, or deliberately destroyed. Take your pick. I don't understand what that has to do with. When the military pulls out of a place, they usually clean up after themselves, Reeves interrupted. Dismantle the buildings, decommission the equipment, seal any tunnels or bunkers. That didn't happen at the Grimshaw place. Leopold Grimshaw stayed, maintained the property, and the government just left him there. Why? Reeves shrugged. Above my pay grade. But I've been sheriff here for 32 years, and in all that time, Leopold Grimshaw was untouchable. Couple times we got calls about trespassers near his property. Each time, before I could even investigate, I'd get a call from somebody in Salem or Washington telling me to stay away, that the property was under federal jurisdiction, that I had no authority there. Daniel felt cold spreading through his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying that property isn't normal. Whatever was there during the war, some part of it might still be active. And if you're seeing strange vehicles, receiving anonymous letters, you might be attracting attention you don't want. Whose attention? Could be anyone. Government agencies checking on old installations. Private contractors doing site surveys. Treasure hunters who've heard rumors. He paused, his eyes sharp on Daniel's face. Or people who know what's really down there and want to make sure it stays hidden. The words hung in the air between them. Daniel struggled to keep his voice steady. What do you suggest I do? If you're smart, you'll pack up your daughter and leave. Put the property on the market. Take whatever you can get for it and forget you ever heard the name Grimshaw. And if I can't leave? If I have nowhere else to go? Sheriff Reeves's expression softened slightly. Then you keep your head down. You don't go poking around in things that aren't your business. And you call me if anything escalates. But Mr. Trent, Daniel, understand that there are limits to what I can do. If federal authorities show up with jurisdiction, I can't protect you. If someone comes onto that property with official paperwork, I can't stop them. Daniel stood, his legs shaky. Thank you for your honesty. One more thing, Reeve said as he reached for the door. Leopold Grimshaw lived on that property for over 60 years. Alone, isolated, maintaining whatever the hell is down there. And he lived to be 86 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep. That's either incredibly good luck, or he knew how to keep secrets. Learn from that. The drive back to the house was silent. Sophie asked a few questions about the town, but Daniel could barely focus enough to answer. His mind was churning, trying to process everything the sheriff had told him. Federal jurisdiction. Active interest. People who knew what was down there. He had to protect himself. More importantly, he had to protect Sophie. Which meant documenting everything and creating insurance evidence that would surface if anything happened to him. Back at the house, while Sophie played with the antique toys in the living room, Daniel got to work. He retrieved the journals from where he'd hidden them in his bedroom, then, steeling himself, he flipped the switches in the fireplace and descended into the complex. He moved quickly this time, with purpose, trying not to think about the motion sensor or who might be watching. He photographed everything, the corridors, the chamber doors, the labels, the filing cabinets. In Chamber 7, he documented the crates, their serial numbers, the treasury stamps. He opened 3 more crates, photographing the platinum bars inside, their weight stamps and dates. Each bar probably worth $30,000 or more at current prices. The whole time, that motion sensor light blinked at him. Red. Yellow. Red. Yellow. A mechanical eye that never closed. Back upstairs, Daniel downloaded the photos onto his laptop, then onto 2 USB drives. He made copies of the most important journal pages on the ancient printer he'd found in Leopold's study. Then he packaged it all up. 1 copy for himself, hidden in the house. And 1 copy in a thick envelope addressed to his brother in California, Michael. They hadn't spoken in almost 2 years, not since Daniel's wife died. Not since Michael had made it clear he thought Daniel was drowning and needed to get his life together. But Michael was also the most reliable person Daniel knew. If something happened, Michael would know what to do with the evidence. Daniel drove to the post office in Thornhill the next morning, a Saturday, and sent the package overnight express, requiring a signature. Insurance, he told himself. Just insurance. That night, the snow came. It started around dusk, fat flakes drifting down from a sky the color of old bruises. Within an hour, it was a proper storm, the kind that made the windows rattle and turned the world beyond them into a white void. Daniel checked the propane tanks, made sure the generator was running smoothly, and brought in extra firewood from the shed. They were prepared to be snowed in for days if necessary. He made dinner, more of the miraculously preserved canned goods, beef stew that tasted like it had been prepared yesterday instead of in 1946. Sophie ate in front of the fireplace, mesmerized by the flames, while Daniel tried not to obsess over every sound the house made. The wind was fierce, howling around the eaves, driving snow against the windows in rattling waves. Perfect cover, Daniel thought, for someone to approach the house unheard. Perfect conditions for strangers in the forest. He put Sophie to bed around 8, read her 2 stories, and sat with her until she fell asleep. Then he went downstairs and tried to read one of Leopold's old books, some thriller from the 1950s, but the words wouldn't stick. His attention kept drifting to the windows, to the storm, to the sealed hidden room door. Around 11, Daniel finally admitted he wasn't going to sleep. He made more of that terrible, wonderful coffee and sat in the kitchen listening to the storm and trying to plan. Maybe the sheriff was right. Maybe they should leave, find somewhere else. Anywhere else. The platinum wasn't worth dying for. Nothing was worth putting Sophie at risk. But where would they go? Back to nowhere. To streets, to shelters and charity. At least here they had a roof, heat, food. At least here they had a chance. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when he heard it. A sound beneath the storm. Faint, almost imperceptible, but distinct. A mechanical sound coming from below. Daniel froze, coffee mug halfway to his lips. The sound came again. Not the usual hum of the generators or the climate control. Something else. Something new. Footsteps. Heavy, booted footsteps walking through the bunker. Someone was in the generator shed. Or near it. Or, Daniel's blood turned to ice, the bunker entrance. The concrete structure he'd found in the woods with the metal plate set into the ground. There must be another way into the complex, a service entrance for maintenance and resupply. And someone was using it. He set down his coffee carefully, his hands trembling. The footsteps continued, muffled by concrete and distance, but definitely there. More than one person. At least two, maybe three, walking through the chambers he'd explored, their boots echoing in the corridors. And then, worse, voices. They came through the heating vents, distorted and faint, but unmistakably human. Men's voices speaking in low tones, the words too muffled to make out. Daniel crept closer to the nearest vent, straining to hear. 7 is sealed. Motion sensor triggered days ago. Here somewhere. The voices faded as the speakers moved deeper into the complex. Daniel's heart was hammering so hard he thought he might pass out. They were in the bunker right now, below his feet. Looking for something. Looking for the platinum. He had to think. Had to move. Had to protect Sophie. Daniel ran upstairs as quietly as he could, his mind racing through options. They could hide, could barricade themselves in a bedroom, could try to run through the storm, though that was suicide with a 7-year-old. Sophie was gone. Her bed was empty, the covers thrown back, her shoes missing from beside the door. Sophie, Daniel hissed, not daring to call out loud. Sophie, where are you? A sound from down the hall. The bathroom. Daniel rushed toward it and found his daughter standing in front of the sink, looking confused and sleepy. I had to pee, she mumbled. Why are you so scared? Daniel grabbed her, pulled her close. Listen to me very carefully. There are people in the house. Bad people. We need to hide. Can you be very, very quiet? Sophie's eyes went wide, but she nodded. Good girl. Smart girl. Daniel pulled her back to her bedroom, opened the closet, and pushed aside the hanging sheets that covered the old clothes. At the back of the closet was a space, maybe 3 feet deep, where the ceiling sloped down. Daniel had noticed it when first exploring the house. Get in there, he whispered. All the way back. Don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I come get you. Dad, I'm scared. I know, sweetheart. I know. But you have to be brave. Can you do that for me? She nodded again, tears on her cheeks, and crawled into the space. Daniel pulled the sheets back in place, then piled some boxes in front of them. Not perfect, but better than nothing. Then he went back downstairs, his mind curiously clear now that Sophie was as safe as he could make her. The voices from the vents had stopped, but he could still hear movement, heavy objects being shifted, metal scraping on concrete. They were opening the crates. Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring at the sealed hidden room door, and realized he had a choice to make. He could hide, hope they took what they wanted and left. Could wait it out, call the sheriff in the morning, pretend he'd slept through the whole thing. Or he could fight. Not physically, he wasn't stupid enough to think he could take on armed men, because they had to be armed. But he had something they didn't know about. He had documentation, evidence, proof of what was down there and who might be after it. And he'd already mailed copies to his brother. If they killed him, if they made him disappear, that evidence would surface. Michael would go to the police, to the media, to anyone who would listen. The secret of Arctic Vault would become very public very quickly. Daniel just had to make sure they knew that. He was still standing there, working up the courage to flip those switches and descend into the bunker to confront whoever was down there, when he noticed something he'd missed before. In the corner of the kitchen, near the ceiling, was a small black dome, about 3 inches across, mounted flush with the wall. He'd assumed it was some kind of smoke detector or carbon monoxide sensor. But now, looking at it directly, he could see the faint gleam of a lens inside. A camera. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He moved through the house, looking at the ceilings with new eyes, and found them everywhere. Kitchen, living room, hallways, even the bedrooms. Small black domes, carefully positioned, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. The entire house was under surveillance. In Leopold's study, he found the evidence he hadn't known to look for: a locked cabinet. He had to break the lock with a hammer. Inside was equipment that looked like it belonged in a security company's office. Monitors, dark now. But when Daniel flipped the power switch, they flickered to life. 12 screens. 12 camera feeds showing every room in the house, every angle. And in the bottom right corner of the master monitor, a date stamp that made Daniel's blood run cold. Live feed. Encrypted transmission. This wasn't just recording. Someone, somewhere, was watching these feeds in real time. Had been watching since Leopold died. Had watched Daniel and Sophie arrive. Had watched him discover the bunker. Had watched everything. And beneath the monitors, a logbook. Daniel flipped it open with shaking hands. Page after page of entries in Leopold's precise handwriting, spanning decades. Times and dates when various government agencies had accessed the feeds. Department of Defense. Treasury. Homeland Security. Names redacted, but the frequency of access was clear. Once a month, like clockwork, for 60 years. Until 3 months ago. The last entry was dated August 19, 2024. After that, nothing. As if whoever had been monitoring had simply stopped checking in, or had been checking in by some other method that Leopold didn't know about. Daniel was staring at the monitors, watching his own kitchen from 4 different angles, when he saw movement on one of the screens. The hidden room door. It was opening. Men were coming up the stairs. 3 of them, dressed in dark tactical gear, faces covered with balaclavas. They moved with military precision. Weapons drawn, he couldn't tell what kind in the grainy camera footage, but definitely weapons. They were searching the house. Daniel backed away from the monitors, his mind blank with terror. He had to get to Sophie. Had to protect her. Had to. The study door opened. One of the men stood there, weapon raised, eyes cold behind the balaclava. He gestured with the gun. "Don't move. Don't scream. Where's the kid?" Daniel's voice came out steady, which surprised him. "She's not here. I sent her to stay with relatives after I saw the strange vehicles. I knew something was wrong." The man cocked his head, listening. Then he touched something on his collar, a radio. Daniel realized. "House is occupied. 1 adult male. Says the kid is off-site." A pause. "Copy that." He lowered the weapon slightly, though it was still pointed in Daniel's general direction. "You've seen things you shouldn't have seen. You understand that?" "I understand I inherited a property," Daniel said. "I understand there's something in the hidden room I wasn't told about. I understand you're trespassing." A sound that might have been a laugh. "Trespassing? That's cute." He moved further into the study, saw the monitors. "Smart. Leopold teach you about the surveillance." "Leopold's journals taught me. Along with the ones from his father, Robert Matthias Grimshaw, who built this facility for Operation Arctic Vault in 1943. The man's posture changed subtly. "Surprise. You've been doing your homework." "I've also been doing something else," Daniel said, his voice stronger now. "I've documented everything. Photos, videos, journal copies, serial numbers from the platinum bars. And I've sent copies to multiple people with instructions to release them if anything happens to me or my daughter." "You're bluffing." "Try me. I mailed a package to my brother in California 3 days ago." Overnight express, signature required. He signed for it. If I don't call him every 72 hours, he has instructions to send copies to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 3 different federal agencies. So if you're planning to make me disappear, you'd better be prepared for Arctic Vault to become front-page news. The silence stretched out. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears. The man touched his radio again. We've got a situation. He's created insurance. Another pause. Yes, sir. Understood. He lowered the weapon completely. You're either very smart or very stupid. Probably both. Here's how this is going to work. You and the kid are going to leave this property tonight. We'll give you an hour to pack. You'll receive compensation, generous compensation, for your cooperation. In exchange, you'll sign documents agreeing to never discuss what you found here. And if I refuse, then we'll have to explore other options. Options you won't like. Daniel forced himself to meet his eyes. How do I know you won't just kill me after I sign your papers? You don't. But consider this, if we wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. The fact that we're negotiating means someone higher up the chain wants this handled quietly. Your insurance policy? It's working. Don't push your luck by demanding more. Footsteps on the stairs. The other 2 men appeared in the doorway. One of them was carrying something, one of Leopold's journals. He handed it to the first man, who flipped through it quickly. Jesus, he muttered. Old man documented everything. No wonder they kept him on payroll. He looked back at Daniel. Where's the rest of these? Safe, Daniel lied. Along with everything else. And where's the kid? Really? Hidden. Somewhere you won't find her. And she stays hidden until I have guarantees. The man considered this, then nodded slowly. Okay. Here's the deal. You get the kid, you pack your essentials, and you come with us. We'll take you to a hotel in Portland. Tomorrow, lawyers will arrive with paperwork and a check. You sign, you take the money, and you never come back here. The property gets transferred to a shell corporation, and it's like you were never here. How much money? $5 million. Daniel's breath caught. $5 million. Enough to start over. Enough to give Sophie everything. Enough to disappear and build a new life somewhere nobody was watching. But also proof that what was in that bunker was worth far more than $5 million. Worth enough to kill 4. To cover up. To protect at all costs. I need to think about it, Daniel said. The man's eyes hardened. You don't get to think about it. The storm is getting worse. We leave now, or we might not be able to leave at all. And trust me, you don't want to be stuck in this house with us all night. It was a threat, barely veiled. Daniel looked at the monitors, at the camera feed showing his empty kitchen, his empty living room, showing the life he'd hoped to build here evaporating like smoke. I need to get my daughter, he said finally. 10 minutes. Pack only what you can carry. We leave at midnight. The men filed out, leaving Daniel alone in the study. He stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. They were taking him away, taking Arctic Vault away. All that platinum, all those secrets, disappearing back into government custody or private hands or wherever these people represented. But he and Sophie would be alive, would have $5 million, would have a future. Unless they were lying. Unless the plan was to make him and Sophie disappear once they had the documentation, once they'd eliminated the insurance policy. Daniel looked at the monitors one more time, and that's when he saw it. On the feed from the hidden room corridor, a 4th person was moving through the chambers. Smaller than the others, moving differently, wearing what looked like a suit instead of tactical gear. This person stopped at Chamber 7, looked directly at the camera, and pulled off their hood. It was a woman, maybe 50, with short grey hair and an expression of cold calculation. She stared at the camera for a long moment, then touched something on her wrist, a phone or communicator, and spoke words Daniel couldn't hear, but he could read her lips, made clear by the high-definition feed. "Clean it all. Every trace." The woman turned and walked away, disappearing into Chamber 7. And Daniel understood. They weren't offering him a deal. They were offering him a grave. The money was bait. The lawyers would never arrive. He and Sophie would be dead before morning, their bodies buried somewhere in this vast forest, their disappearance blamed on the storm or bad roads or any of a dozen convenient accidents. The insurance policy might save them. Might not. But he couldn't risk it. Daniel moved quickly. Quietly. He went to Sophie's room, pulled her out of the closet. "We're leaving right now. No questions." "But Dad." "Now, Sophie." He grabbed their coats, their shoes, threw some clothes into a bag. The men had said 10 minutes. He had maybe 5 before they came looking. Through the window, he could see the storm still raging. Suicide to go out in it. But more suicidal to stay. Daniel carried Sophie down the back stairs, avoiding the cameras, moving through the kitchen toward the rear door. He could hear voices from the front of the house, the men talking, coordinating, preparing. His hand was on the doorknob when a voice behind him said, "Going somewhere." Daniel turned. The woman from the monitor feed stood in the kitchen doorway. No weapon visible, but radiating menace like heat from a furnace. "We had a deal," Daniel said. The woman smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "We did." Past tense. "Because you were right. What's down there is worth far more than 5 million. Worth more than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. And you've seen it, documented it, made yourself into a problem. My insurance will be handled. Your brother will have an accident. Very tragic. Car crash, probably. The package will burn with him. And you'll disappear into these woods. Another victim of the terrible winter storm." Daniel pulled Sophie behind him. "Touch her and the entire world knows about Arctic Vault. I sent more than one package. You're bluffing. Try me." The woman's smile faded. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't just platinum. This is American history. Secrets that could destabilize governments, ruin reputations, start wars. We've protected Arctic Vault for 80 years. You think we'll let some nobody burn it all down?" "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that I'm that nobody's only chance of keeping this quiet. Kill me and you'll have to kill my brother and everyone else I sent evidence to, and you'll have to explain the bodies, the investigation, all of it. Or you let me walk away and I keep my mouth shut." The woman considered this for one terrible moment. Daniel thought she'd call his bluff. Then she stepped aside. "Go," she said. "Take your brat and run. But understand this, we'll be watching. Always. One word about what you found here, one hint, one whisper, and you'll spend the rest of your short life looking over your shoulder." Daniel didn't wait for her to change her mind. He pulled Sophie through the door and into the storm. The snow hit them like a wall, blinding, freezing. Daniel couldn't see 5 feet ahead, but he ran anyway, carrying Sophie when she couldn't keep up, plunging into the forest without looking back. Behind them, the house blazed with light. Ahead, only darkness and the howling wind and the promise of escape, if they could survive the storm, if they could find their way out, if they could leave the inheritance nobody wanted behind and never look back. But as Daniel ran, Sophie heavy in his arms, the forest closing around them like a trap, he knew the truth. They would never be free of Arctic Vault. Never be free of the strangers who came in the snow. The watching had just begun. Daniel ran blindly through the storm, his lungs burning with cold air, Sophie's weight growing heavier with each step. The snow came at them horizontally, driven by wind that shrieked through the firs like something alive and angry. He couldn't see the house anymore, couldn't see anything but white chaos and the dark shapes of trees materializing seconds before he crashed into them. Dad, Sophie sobbed against his shoulder. I can't. I'm so cold. Daniel stumbled, went down on one knee in a snow drift that came up to his thigh. His hands were already numb, his face burning with cold. They'd been outside maybe 5 minutes and hypothermia was already setting in. He'd run without thinking, pure panic overriding reason. And now they were lost in a blizzard with no shelter, no supplies, no way to survive until morning. He pulled Sophie tighter against him, trying to shield her with his body. Think. He had to think. The generator shed. It was maybe 100 yards behind the house, wasn't it? If he could find it, they'd have shelter, heat, at least a chance. But which direction? He'd lost all sense of orientation in the storm. The world was a white void punctuated by black tree trunks, all of them looking the same, offering no landmarks. Then he saw it, a light, faint, yellowish, barely visible through the snow. The house? No, wrong direction. The generator shed had an exterior light. He remembered seeing it. An old bulb in a metal cage, the kind that ran off the propane system. Daniel forced himself to his feet, adjusted Sophie in his arms, and pushed toward the light. Every step was agony, his legs burning with effort, his lungs screaming for air. But the light grew brighter, closer, real. The generator shed materialized out of the storm like a gift from God. Daniel fell against the door, fumbled with frozen fingers for the handle, and nearly cried with relief when it opened. He tumbled inside with Sophie, slamming the door against the wind. The temperature inside was maybe 40 degrees, nowhere near comfortable, but compared to the lethal cold outside, it felt like a sauna. The generators hummed steadily, their waste heat radiating from the metal housings. A single bulb in the ceiling cast everything in harsh yellow light. Daniel set Sophie down on a workbench, checked her over with shaking hands. Her lips were blue, her skin dangerously pale, but her eyes were open and tracking. Stay here, he ordered. Don't move. I need to figure out what to do. The shed was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, packed with equipment, the 2 generators, both running, propane tanks lined against one wall, tool racks, spare parts, maintenance logs. And in the back corner, partially hidden behind a fuel drum, a metal footlocker he hadn't noticed during his first quick survey. Daniel dragged it out, his hands barely functional. The lock was rusted but not engaged. He popped it open. More journals, of course. The Grimshaw family seemed pathologically compelled to document everything. These were different from the ones he'd found before, smaller, more recent, the handwriting shakier. He opened the top one, saw a date from 2015, and Leopold's familiar precise script. But it was the journal beneath that one that caught his attention. Older, the cover water-stained and cracked. He pulled it out, flipped it open to a random page, and felt his breath catch. It was Robert Grimshaw's handwriting, but not from the war years. This was dated August 9, 1953, nearly a decade after the war had ended. I've made a decision that may cost me my life, but I can no longer stand by and watch them steal what I helped create. 2 days ago, I received orders from a Colonel Morrison. I'd never heard of him before, which should have been my first warning. He claimed to be from Army intelligence, said he had authorization from the highest levels to inventory and relocate the contents of Arctic Vault, the platinum specifically, all of it, to be moved to Fort Knox or some other facility. He had paperwork that looked official, but something about it felt wrong. I contacted General Ashford, the same Ashford who'd overseen the original construction, only to discover he'd died in '49. Heart attack, supposedly. When I tried to verify Colonel Morrison's credentials through other channels, I was told I no longer had clearance for that information, that Arctic Vault was above my authorization level now. Me. The man who built it. They're going to steal it. I'm certain of it now. This isn't an official relocation. This is a heist dressed up in military paperwork, probably orchestrated by someone high enough in the government to make it look legitimate. The platinum will disappear, be melted down and sold, and no one will ever know because Arctic Vault officially doesn't exist. I won't let that happen. Leopold and I have spent the last 48 hours working around the clock. We've modified the security systems, added fail-safes the original designers never imagined. If anyone tries to remove the platinum without the proper access codes, the entire facility will seal itself. Airtight. Impenetrable. They'll need industrial cutting equipment and weeks of work to get through the barriers we've installed. The codes are hidden in 3 places. One set is with Leopold, memorized. One set is buried in the foundation of the house itself, encoded in the electrical system. Any good engineer could find it if they knew what to look for. And one set is here, in this journal, because I'm old enough to know that memory fails and buildings can burn. If someone is reading this, if you found Arctic Vault and you're trying to understand what happened, know this: the platinum is American platinum, bought with American taxes, meant to protect American citizens in case of catastrophe. It was never meant to line the pockets of corrupt officials. Whatever you do with it, honor that purpose. Use it to help people, to build something good, to ensure that my son's sacrifice, his lifetime of lonely duty, wasn't for nothing. The entry continued with technical details, diagrams of the modifications they'd made. Daniel's eyes flew over the pages, his frozen mind trying to absorb the implications. Robert and Leopold had essentially turned Arctic Vault into a vault that could seal itself, trapping anyone inside who tried to remove the platinum without authorization. An insurance policy against theft. But had they ever triggered it? Had the mysterious Colonel Morrison and his men tried to take the platinum? He flipped through more pages, found another entry dated August 20th, 1953. They came. Morrison and 6 men, all armed. They had trucks, equipment, everything ready to strip the facility. When I refused to give them the access codes, Morrison pulled a gun, said he had orders to retrieve the platinum by any means necessary. I told him the facility was rigged, that if he tried to force his way in, he'd seal himself inside. He didn't believe me, called me a senile old man playing soldier. Put the gun to Leopold's head and said he'd start shooting if I didn't cooperate. I gave him codes, but not the right ones. Close enough that they'd seem legitimate, that they'd bypass the first 2 security levels. But when they tried to access Chamber 7, when they started loading platinum into their trucks, the failsafe triggered exactly as designed. Steel barriers dropped in the corridors. Ventilation sealed. The emergency lighting switched to backup mode, enough to see by, but preserving power. Morrison and his men were trapped in the outer sections with about 12 hours of air. They screamed threats for the first hour. Tried to shoot their way out for the second. By the 3rd hour, they were begging. By the 6th, they were offering me anything: money, protection, immunity from prosecution. Leopold wanted to let them die. I was tempted. But I'm not a murderer, despite what they tried to do to us. At hour 11, with their oxygen nearly gone, I gave them the override codes. Release them. They came out coughing, pale, half dead with fear. Morrison put his gun to my head. His hand was shaking so badly I thought he might shoot me by accident. But then one of his men, young kid, barely 20, said, "Sir, we need to leave. If this gets reported, we're all dead. Courts-martial, prison, maybe worse." Morrison lowered the gun, looked at me with eyes full of hate, and said, "You'll regret this. We'll be back." But they never came back. I made inquiries, carefully. Discovered Morrison was killed 3 months later. Car accident in California. Very convenient. 2 of his men died within the year, both in suspicious circumstances. The others disappeared into military bureaucracy, reassigned to distant posts. Someone cleaned up the mess. Someone made Morrison's attempted theft disappear. But they left Arctic Vault alone, left Leopold and me to continue our watch. Maybe they realized the facility was too well defended. Maybe they decided the risk wasn't worth it. Or maybe whoever ordered the hit on Morrison decided the platinum was safer here, forgotten, than in official vaults where other corrupt officials might try for it. I'll never know. But I know this: the platinum stays. The facility stays sealed. And Leopold stays on guard for as long as he lives. It's not the life I wanted for my son, but it's the life he chose. God forgive me. The journal ended there. Daniel sat on the cold floor of the generator shed, the pieces finally clicking into place. This wasn't just a cache of platinum. This was evidence of government corruption, of attempted theft, of a cover-up that had lasted 70 years. The people in the house, the woman, the men with guns, they were the spiritual descendants of Colonel Morrison. Different faces, but the same mission: steal the platinum and erase the evidence. But Robert and Leopold had built safeguards. The facility could seal itself, could trap intruders. All he needed was the access codes. He flipped back through the journal frantically, found the page with the technical diagrams. There, encoded in what looked like electrical specifications, was a sequence of numbers and letters. Not obvious, but clear once you knew what you were looking for: the override codes that would trigger the security lockdown. Daniel looked at Sophie, who was watching him with frightened eyes. "Sweetheart, I need to go back to the house." "No." Her voice cracked with terror. "Dad, please. They'll hurt you. They'll hurt us worse if we stay out here. We'll freeze to death before morning. But if I can seal them in the bunker, trap them like Grandpa Robert trapped Colonel Morrison, the authorities will find them when they come looking. The evidence I sent to Uncle Michael, that's going to bring people here. Police, FBI, somebody. We just need to survive until then." "I don't understand." "You don't need to. You just need to trust me. Can you do that?" Sophie nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. Daniel stood, his legs protesting, and studied the generator equipment. Robert's journal had been specific. The codes weren't just numbers you typed into a keypad. They had to be entered through the electrical system itself, using the original control panel that was built into the house's foundation, a panel that, according to the diagrams, was hidden behind the water heater in the utility room. Which meant he had to go back into the house. Had to get to the utility room. Had to trigger the security system while the intruders were still down there. And he had to do it without getting caught or killed. Daniel found a heavy flashlight on the tool rack, checked that it worked. Then he turned to Sophie. "I'm going to lock you in here. Don't open the door for anyone except me. If someone else tries to get in, there's a crawl space behind those fuel drums. See it? Hide there and don't make a sound. I'll be back in 20 minutes. I promise. What if you don't come back?" Daniel knelt in front of his daughter, took her face in his frozen hands. "Then you wait until morning. The storm will stop. You walk back to the road and you flag down the first car you see. You tell them your name and that your dad sent evidence to the FBI about illegal activity at this address. You don't mention platinum or bunkers or anything else. Just that. Can you remember that? Evidence to the FBI. Evidence to the FBI," Sophie repeated, her voice small, "about illegal activity. Good girl. Now hide and wait for me." Daniel sealed her in the shed and turned back toward the storm. The house was invisible, but he could orient himself by the generator shed's position. Straight ahead, maybe 100 yards. He could do this. The walk back was easier than the flight out had been. He knew where he was going now. Had a goal. The cold was still brutal, but adrenaline kept him moving. Within minutes, he saw the lights of the house emerging from the white chaos. He approached from the back, away from the main entrance, and found the rear door unlocked. Good. They'd expected him to run into the forest and die. Hadn't bothered securing the house behind them. Inside was warm, almost shocking after the cold. Daniel stood in the mudroom, dripping melting snow, listening. Voices from the front of the house. The men arguing about something. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frustrated. He moved through the kitchen, silent in his soaked boots. The hidden room door was standing open. They were still down there, then. Still in the complex, cataloging the platinum or whatever they were doing. Perfect. The stairs beckoned. Daniel descended as quietly as he could, his heart hammering. At the bottom, the corridor stretched ahead, lit by those emergency lights. Empty. The chamber doors stood open, evidence of the intruder's search, but no one was in sight. Daniel moved to the water heater, tucked into an alcove near the base of the stairs. It was old, probably original to the house, a massive tank that looked like it belonged in a ship's engine room. Behind it, barely visible, was a gap in the concrete wall. He squeezed into the space, the flashlight clutched between his teeth, and found what he was looking for. A metal panel, about 2 feet square, painted the same grey as the walls. Easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. He pried it open with his freezing fingers. Inside was a control board that looked like something from a 1940s submarine, Bakelite switches, brass contacts, wiring wrapped in cloth insulation. And in the center, a rotary dial with letters and numbers around its circumference. This was it. The master control for Arctic Vault security system. Daniel pulled out Robert's journal, compared the codes to the dial settings. The sequence was complex, 12 separate positions that had to be engaged in precise order. Get one wrong and the system wouldn't activate. Or worse, it might activate incorrectly, sealing the wrong sections or causing a catastrophic failure. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the dial. Deep breath. Focus. He could do this. First position, K. He rotated the dial carefully, felt it click into place. Second position, 7, click. Third position, R, click. He was on the 6th position when he heard footsteps. Someone coming up the corridor, boots echoing on concrete. Daniel froze, squeezed back into the alcove, praying the shadows would hide him. One of the men walked past, maybe 10 feet away. He was talking into a radio. Yeah, we've got maybe 30 crates catalogued so far. Serial numbers match the treasury logs from 44 and 45. This is the real deal. A pause. No sign of the man or kid. They're either dead in the storm or will be soon. Morrison is right. We clean this place, remove the bodies in a few days when the snow melts, and it's like they were never here. The woman's voice crackled back, distorted by static. Make sure you check the house again. He had journals, documentation. Find it and burn it. I want zero evidence this place exists. Copy that. The man continued up the stairs. Daniel heard the door close behind him. He was trapped down here now, but at least he could work without fear of immediate interruption. He returned to the control panel. 6th position, 9, 7th, T, 8 through 12, following Robert's careful notation. On the 12th position, as the dial clicked into place, something changed. A deep vibration ran through the walls, felt more than heard. Then from somewhere in the complex, a sound like thunder, metal slamming into metal, massive and final. The security barriers were deploying. Daniel squeezed out from behind the water heater just in time to see it happen. At the far end of the corridor, a steel wall dropped from the ceiling with a crash that shook dust from the rafters. Another barrier slammed down near the entrance to Chamber 7. And another. And another. Sectioning off the complex into sealed compartments. Shouts from deeper in the facility. The woman's voice, sharp with alarm. What's happening? Morrison, report. More crashes. The emergency lighting flickered, then stabilized. Somewhere, an alarm began to wail, a rising and falling siren that sounded like something from a World War II film. The barriers had trapped them. Everyone who was in the deep sections of the complex, the woman, at least 2 of the men, maybe more, they were sealed in now. The outer corridor where Daniel stood remained open, but everything beyond the first set of chambers was cut off by thick steel walls. Daniel ran for the stairs, took them 3 at a time. As he burst back into the kitchen, he nearly collided with one of the men, the one who'd walked past him minutes ago. His eyes went wide with shock. How did you? Daniel didn't think. He grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all his strength. It connected with his temple with a sound like a hammer hitting a melon. The man went down hard, his weapon clattering across the floor. Daniel stared at him, at the growing pool of blood beneath his head, and felt nothing but numb satisfaction. He'd just given someone a potentially fatal head injury, and all he could think was, good. He grabbed his radio, his weapon, some kind of compact submachine gun he had no idea how to use, and ran for the front door. Behind him, from below, he could hear muffled screaming, the trapped intruders realizing they were sealed in. The barriers were airtight. Robert's journal had said they had maybe 12 to 18 hours of oxygen, depending on how many people were trapped and how much they panicked. Let them panic. Let them suffer like they'd planned to make him and Sophie suffer. Daniel retrieved Sophie from the generator shed, wrapped her in every blanket he could find, and settled them both in the Honda with the engine running for heat. Then he waited, the stolen radio in his lap, listening to the increasingly frantic communications from the trapped intruders. Can't get through. The barrier is at least 6 inches of reinforced steel. Oxygen levels dropping. We need Morrison. Do you copy? Morrison. The security system has been triggered. We need immediate extraction. The woman, Morrison, apparently, had stopped responding. Either she was working on a solution or she'd accepted her fate. Daniel didn't care which. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of grey and pink, Daniel saw vehicles approaching. Real vehicles this time. Official ones. State police cruisers, followed by unmarked SUVs that screamed federal agents. Sheriff Reeves was in the lead car. He approached the Honda slowly, hands visible, no weapon drawn. Daniel rolled down the window. "Mr. Trent," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We received a call from the FBI about 7 hours ago. They said they'd received evidence of illegal activity at this address. Classified material, potential theft of government property. We've been trying to reach you, but the phone lines are down and the storm." He stopped, took in Daniel's appearance. "Are you all right? Is your daughter all right?" "There are people in the house," Daniel said, his voice rough from cold and exhaustion. "At least one man unconscious in the kitchen. I hit him. And more trapped in the facility below. They're armed. They threatened to kill me and my daughter." Reeves's expression hardened. He turned, made hand signals to the other officers. Within minutes, the house was surrounded. Daniel gave them Robert's journal, showed them the codes for releasing the security barriers, explained as much as he understood about Arctic Vault and Operation Arctic Vault and what had happened. The FBI agents, because that's what they were, he learned, from a specialized unit that handled classified facility breaches, took over from there. It took them 6 hours to carefully release the barriers, extract the trapped intruders, and secure the complex. 3 people had been sealed in the deep sections, Morrison and 2 men, both former military contractors according to their IDs. All 3 were arrested, along with the man Daniel had injured and 1 more who'd been outside coordinating the operation. But it was the platinum that caused the real chaos. When the FBI fully catalogued Arctic Vault's contents over the following weeks, they discovered something that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. The platinum bars, 873 of them, to be exact, had serial numbers that matched a shipment that had officially been lost in transit in 1944. The story at the time was that a transport convoy had been ambushed somewhere in the Pacific Theater, the platinum seized by enemy forces or lost in the chaos of war. But it had never left the United States. It had been hidden here, at Arctic Vault, part of the emergency cache. And when the war ended, when the facility was supposed to be decommissioned, someone had simply forgotten about it. Or deliberately erased the records, planning to come back for it later. The current value, according to Treasury estimates, $150 million, give or take. It was the biggest recovery of lost government assets in American history. And it had been sitting under a house in rural Oregon for 80 years, guarded by one lonely man who devoted his entire life to a duty no one remembered. The legal process that followed was Byzantine. Daniel retained a lawyer, an excellent one, paid for by a rapidly established legal defense fund after his story hit the news. Leopold's journals became evidence, along with Robert's, documenting not just Arctic Vault but the attempted theft in 1953 and the subsequent cover-up. The Treasury Department wanted the platinum back. The Pentagon claimed jurisdiction. Congress launched investigations. Documentaries were filmed. Daniel and Sophie were interviewed by everyone from local news to 60 Minutes. Through it all, Daniel refused to sell the journals. They were offered obscene amounts, millions of dollars from collectors, from museums, from universities. But he kept them, every single page, because they were more than just historical documents. They were his family's story. Robert's dedication. Leopold's sacrifice. The truth that powerful people had tried to bury. In the end, after 18 months of legal wrangling, the government reached a settlement. Daniel couldn't keep the platinum, it belonged to the American people, had always belonged to the American people. But he was entitled to compensation. A finder's fee, his lawyers called it, though it felt like more than that. Recognition of his family's service, perhaps. Or maybe just the government's desire to make the whole mess go away quietly. $12 million. Enough to change his life. To give Sophie everything she needed. To build something real and lasting. Not the fortune that was sitting in those chambers, but more than Daniel had ever dreamed of having. They took it, signed the papers, accepted the conditions, including an NDA that prevented him from discussing certain classified aspects of Arctic Vault's operations. The house and property reverted to federal custody, to be preserved for historical purposes, though Daniel suspected it would simply be sealed up again and forgotten. But he kept the journals. That was non-negotiable. The government could have the platinum, the facility, the secrets. But his family's words, their story, that belonged to him and Sophie. 2 years later, Daniel stood in the living room of a house in Washington state, a real house. Not a preserved museum or a government installation, but a normal home with normal neighbors and a normal life. Sophie was in 4th grade now, thriving in school, making friends, learning to be a kid instead of a survivor. He'd used some of the settlement money to establish a foundation in Leopold and Robert Grimshaw's names, providing support for military families and veterans struggling with the aftermath of classified service. The rest he'd invested carefully, ensuring Sophie would have opportunities he'd never had: college, travel, choices. But late at night, when Sophie was asleep and the house was quiet, Daniel would sometimes pull out the journals. Robert's meticulous engineering notes. Leopold's lonely log entry spanning 6 decades of faithful duty to a mission the world had forgotten. His family's legacy, preserved in fading ink and yellowed pages. He thought about the life Leopold had lived. 86 years, most of them spent alone, guarding a secret that no one cared about anymore. He could have left at any time, walked away, used the platinum, built a different life. But he'd stayed. Faithful to the end. Because he'd made a promise. Daniel didn't know if that was admirable or tragic. Maybe it was both. But he knew this: Leopold had left him more than property. He'd left him a lesson about resilience, about duty, about the quiet strength required to keep going when no one was watching and no one cared. In his way, he'd been preparing Daniel for this moment, for the chance to take his sacrifice and transform it into something good, something that helped people, something that mattered. The real treasure hadn't been the $150 million in platinum. It had been the truth. The journals. The story of forgotten people doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances. His family's truth, finally brought to light after 80 years in the dark. Year-old face serious. Something hard that nobody knows about. Sometimes Daniel would tell Sophie stories about her great-great-grandfather Robert, the engineer who built impossible things. About her great-great-uncle Leopold, who spent his life keeping a promise. He made sure Sophie understood where she came from, that her family story was one of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances and choosing to do the right thing, even when it cost them everything. "Will I have to do something like that?" Sophie asked once, her 7-year-old face serious. Something hard that nobody knows about. Daniel pulled her close. "I hope not, sweetheart. I hope you get to have a normal, happy life. But if you do have to face something hard, and everyone does eventually, you'll know you come from people who faced hard things and survived. That's in you. That resilience, that strength. It's part of who you are. Sophie thought about this. Then, Dad, do you think Uncle Leopold was happy? It was a question Daniel had asked himself 1,000 times. I think he was satisfied, he said finally. I think he knew he'd done something important, protected something valuable. Maybe that's a different kind of happiness. Maybe that's enough. He didn't know if that was true. Didn't know if Leopold had died at peace or full of regret for the life he'd never lived. But he chose to believe he'd found meaning in his duty, purpose in his sacrifice, because the alternative, that he'd wasted his life guarding platinum in a forgotten bunker, was too sad to contemplate. The journals sat on the shelf in Daniel's study, behind glass, preserved and protected. Someday, when Sophie was older, he'd give them to her. Let her decide what to do with them. Whether to donate them to an archive or keep them in the family. For now, they were his to guard. His inheritance of truth and memory and resilience. Outside, snow was falling again. Gentle Washington snow. Not the killing blizzard of that terrible night 2 years ago. Daniel watched it accumulate on the lawn, on the trees, pure and white and clean. Starting over, he thought. That's what the snow represented, a fresh beginning, covering the past but not erasing it. Building something new on top of old foundations. He thought about Arctic Vault sometimes. Wondered if it was still there, sealed up beneath the Oregon forest, or if the government had finally excavated it, moved its contents to secure facilities, erased it from the landscape. Part of him hoped it was still there, waiting, a monument to the forgotten people who'd built it and guarded it and kept faith with a promise that outlasted memory. But mostly he just felt grateful. Grateful to be alive, to have Sophie, to have escaped with their lives and their sanity intact. The platinum had changed their circumstances, but it was the journals, the truth, that had changed their understanding of who they were and where they came from. Sometimes forgotten people inherit the world's biggest secrets. Sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. And sometimes the greatest treasure isn't platinum or jewels or money, but the truth about who we are and what we're capable of when survival demands courage we didn't know we possessed. Daniel closed the curtains against the falling snow and went to check on Sophie. She was asleep, safe and warm, dreaming whatever dreams 9-year-olds dream. He stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her breathe, thinking about Robert and Leopold and all the lonely vigils they'd kept so that someday someone like Sophie could sleep peacefully in a warm bed, free from fear. Thank you, he whispered to ghosts he'd never met. Thank you for watching, for waiting, for keeping faith. The house was silent except for the hum of the heater and the soft sound of snow against the windows. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The sounds of a life rebuilt from ruins, of survival transformed into peace. And in the study, behind glass, the journals waited, preserving memory, holding truth, witnesses to the fact that sometimes the people history forgets are the ones who save us all.